And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
It's reported Milley, Chinese spy balloon, collected no intelligence. 7 months ago, a Chinese weather balloon floated over the U.S., causing the American official to cancel high-level meetings in Beijing. Maybe folks need to understand the difference between causation and correlation. Or maybe we should ask ourselves, when is a spy balloon not a spy balloon? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, told CBS News Sunday morning the U.S. intelligence community does not believe the craft collected intelligence, but still maintained it was a spy balloon. He said the intelligence community, their assessment, and it's a high confidence assessment, is that there was no intelligence collection by that balloon. I would say it was a spy balloon that we know with a high degree of certainty got no intelligence and didn't transmit any intelligence back to China. So, Dr. Horne, when is a spy balloon not a spy balloon?
I think when it floats over the western United States all the way virtually to the Atlantic coast. This was obviously a kind of made-up scandal. Why is really the ultimate question. That is to say, it led to, as you suggested, a disruption in bilateral ties between Beijing and Washington. Perhaps, as ever, U.S. imperialism overreached and overestimated its strength because it led to this remarkable display whereby a flood of U.S. high-ranking officials, including Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of the Treasury Yellen, Secretary of the Commerce Raimondo, Climate Czar Kerry, have streamed into Beijing, oftentimes with begging bowl in hand, because we know that the not-so-hidden agenda in these bilateral ties is the People's Bank in Beijing helping to buy U.S. Treasury bills up to the trillions. That's with a TR, although, quite frankly, they're liquidating that amount as we speak. And that helps to keep the U.S. government afloat and keep paychecks going to those aforementioned high-ranking U.S. officials. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Beijing has been loath to send its representatives to Washington, which is an implicit slap in the face of U.S. imperialism, we know that the National Security Advisor, Jake the Snake Sullivan, is meeting this week with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, in Malta, the island off the southern coast of Europe. They will have a full agenda to pour over because what's happening is that there is an evident shift in the global correlation of forces away from U.S. imperialism. You saw that this past week at this important gathering in Cuba that received little or no publicity in the United States. I'm speaking of the Group of 77, a counterpoint to the Group of 7 led by the U.S., the Group of 77 meeting headed by Cuba with a special representative from, you guessed it, the People's Republic of China. You saw President Lula of Brazil also holding forth, denouncing the blockade against Cuba and also demanding, along with solidarity activists in this country, that Cuba be replaced or be removed from the so-called terrorism list. You also saw in the past week President Maduro of Venezuela go to China, where he was greeted and embraced by President Xi Jinping, and you saw that their relationship also escalated. Now, what is the fly in the ointment, I'm afraid to say, is that many of our organizations on this side of the Pacific and this side of the Atlantic, speaking of the United States, are not necessarily aware of these profound changes. They're not even aware of the fact that U.S. pressure on Venezuela causes an outflow of migration out of that South American country, with Venezuelans winding up on the streets of Manhattan, and then leaders of the NAACP scratching their heads, unaware of the wider forces that's leading to that, but certainly more than willing to raise criticisms of this migratory flow. And that simply won't do. I think it's also apparent with regard to the global correlation of forces that this meeting between President Putin of Russia and Chairman Kim of the Democratic People's Republic of China also needs to be studied more carefully to give you an idea of how some imperialist hacks are reacting. One suggested that somehow, despite the glare of the global media, that Chairman Kim and President Putin slipped out for a trilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping. Now, I say that not for the truth of the matter asserted, as the attorneys might say, but also to suggest the state of mind of these imperialist hacks as they're scratching their heads or wondering how to make heads or tails out of this shift in the global correlation of forces. Now, we're also told that a subtext of this Kim-Putin meeting is supposedly the North Koreans shipping shells, artillery shells to Russia, although a wiser head suggests that actually what's in store is that Russia is going to buckle down and seek to develop the bulk of its territory, which is east of the Ural Mountains, but that's not where the bulk of its population rests, and that they would like to rely upon the ultra-skilled North Korean workers and construction workers in particular to do so. So, once again, this is emblematic of these Copernican shifts in the global correlation of forces. This flap about the spy balloon and Washington being forced to edge closer to the truth about it is only symptomatic of how there is hysteria and hyperbole attending to this shift in the global correlation of forces.
Now, here's an important story. Again, Milley's saying a lot of stuff. General Milley, he says that the U.S., quote, we should try our very best to avoid open conflict with China. He talks about World War I and World War II. I find that quite interesting in the context of everything that's going on now. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I'm sure Mr. Milley is well aware of these newspaper headlines that I've seen in recent days, talking about both Chinese and Russian advances in terms of developing these so-called hypersonic missiles. And as well, we know that as we speak, unfolding in New York is the annual gathering of world leaders. We know that President Zelensky is expected to show up with his begging bowl. He, of course, is slated to go to Washington as well. We know that President Biden will be giving a speech within the next 24 to 48 hours. And we also know that in terms of this encirclement plan of Russia, President Biden will be meeting with leaders of the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, et cetera, that is to say former constituent republics of the Soviet Union. But of course, since he carries a begging bowl in his back pocket, he will not have much to offer these leaders, who, of course, have very good relations, not only with Russia, but with China. Speaking of the meeting of world leaders in New York, there's breaking news. It has not been confirmed, but there is an apparent coup unfolding in Congo-Brazzaville, the Republic of the Congo, against the 80-year-old leader, Denis Nguesso, who, of course, is in New York. His spokespersons back in Africa deny it. If this rumor proves to be accurate, this will be another withering blow against French neocolonialism, not least because Congo-Brazzaville historically has been one of the more ideologically advanced countries on the continent, back to the good old days when we recall it as the People's Republic of Congo, when they were hosting wide and sprawling delegations from the then Black Panther Party of the United States of America. Stay tuned.
And AfricaNews.com says the Congo-Brazzaville government has refuted recent claims of a coup. attempt against the president. He's held office for more than 39 years. And you talked about this very event, I want to say, on Thursday or Friday of last week. You said if there were going to be I think this is what you said, if there was going to be another coup, look to Congo Brazzaville for the place for it to be.
Well, yes, and it's not because I carry my
your crystal ball.
I don't carry my crystal ball along with me, but you don't have to be an oracle to recognize that walking on a banana peel are the leaders not only of Congo Brazzaville but of Cameroon. 90-year-old Paul Biya, who spends most of his time in Switzerland, not to mention the King of Morocco, who spends most of his time in Paris, and of course has responded in a ill-fated, ill-advised manner to the recent earthquake that rocked Marrakesh. So once again, one only has to read the newspapers to figure out where important, profound changes are coming.
Age of Times, trade war, tech war, chip war, electric vehicle war. You know, ever since the war on drugs and the war on poverty, it looks like everything we metaphorically name a war, the U.S. loses. Your thoughts on all of the so-called wars against China, and hopefully it doesn't become a nuclear war. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, hopefully indeed. And of course, with regard to the chip war, we're all paying close and careful attention to the fact that Huawei, which was the United States attempted to destroy that Chinese corporation under the Trump regime, but now it's developed a chip that will allow it to compete more effectively with Apple, which of course is busily trying to move production from China to India, which brings up another point, which is how is the United States credibly going to encircle China when you have corporations not only like Apple, but Tesla and Microsoft and KFC and Starbucks that are heavily dependent upon the Chinese market and Chinese workers. Either those corporations are going to have to take a haircut, that is to say, suffer a loss in profits, or they're going to continue to be squeezed by Beijing, which will not make their shareholders happy. Speaking of which, another problem that U.S. imperialism is going to have to confront are these waves of strikes at home, capped off by the recent strike of the United Auto Workers, who, of course, are disturbed by the actions of the Biden administration, which they see as undermining their position by moving aggressively to subsidize electric vehicles, which do not require as many members of their union to manufacture. And, of course, looming overhead once again is not a spy balloon, but the specter of Chinese EVs, Chinese electric vehicles led by BYD, which, of course, stole the show at the Munich Auto Show in Germany just a few days ago.
And this announcement comes after French President Macron said in May that the European Union should not allow China to capture its EV sector in the same manner it has for solar panels, where China now has 80% of the market. What happened to the free market system? What happened to unbridled capitalism, which we're all supposed to be so wedded to and beneficiaries of? China just seems to be playing the game better than everybody else is playing the game. We got 1 minute, Dr. Horne.
Well, what happened is, to coin a phrase, gone with the wind. That is to say that the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year under the Biden regime, providing massive subsidies to the green economy, is just a pale imitation of what China has been doing in terms of steering its economy, a leader not only in EVs, but also in solar panels, not to mention quantum computing and other emblems of the scientific and technological revolution. So China is setting the pace. U.S. imperialism is scrambling to keep up, but I'm afraid to say that this game might be over before it gets into motion.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.